So what I'm going to do, I'll just give you an overview of what we're going to do today, and we'll see how far we get. I was going to be presenting with Lorna Goldberg in this slot. Unfortunately, she couldn't come to the conference, so you've only got me. So we have you have an hour and a half with me. So, I'm going to introduce it, and then I'm going to talk about introjection, types of leadership, unmasking the leader, thought reform, the cult pseudo-identity, what is recovery, what helps, the phases and regions, and then if I have time, I'll talk briefly about my workbook. I have another session this afternoon just talking about walking free, so I won't say a lot about it now. And this talk is called Perspectives on How Cults Shape Aspects of Post-Cult Character and Identity. In your on the flyer, it has conscience as well, which Lorna was going to really concentrate on. So there's no time to concentrate on everything, so I'll do that. So who am I? Well, my name's Gillie Jenkinson, I know that, and usually I give a thing about, I was in a cult, I came out, I trained as a therapist. I was very traumatized by the experience. And as I was going through my own recovery process, I started to train. And long story short, diploma in pastoral counselling, a master's in Gestalt, and a PhD. And I always asking the question, what helps former cult members recover? And I did that with 29 for my PhD, just a mixed participant profile, some multiple fifth generation, some second generation, and some first generation. So I tried to generalize across those populations. But also, I'm a mother. I have two beautiful daughters. I have a lovely husband. I have a rescue dog who I rescued 9 months ago, and I think our attachment is just about in place now. He needed a bit of healing, he needed a good, secure attachment, and he's with the dog sitter, and apparently he's happy, so yay! So I love reading novels. Somebody asked me last night, Graham, like, what do you enjoy? I like Star Trek. I like all sorts of different things. I read a novel to fall asleep. I have a life. I live in a beautiful area, and I have a passion for this field. So I try and keep the balance. So that's me. I wanted to give a fuller view of who I am. And I'm not really what I look like, because I rather shocked Graham at supper last night, because I look like this middle-class British woman. I was born in Africa, and so there's a part of Africa inside me, and I swear like a trooper, and I like Game of Thrones, so there you go. So all sorts. So that's who I am. So there's a lot of people here. So I was going to hope to kind of get a conversation, but this is an illustration. Hi, welcome. Illustration from my book about baggage carrying when we move. This is my book, in case I didn't say. And so what does shape our identity in a cultic setting? Conformity, peer pressure.
Hearing the same thing over and over and over.
Yeah, hearing the same thing over and over.
The leader's preferences.
The leader's preferences.
Fear of judgment.
Yeah, fear of judgment.
Shame.
Shame.
Punishments and reward.
Punishments and rewards. Yeah. So all of these are shaping, moulding who, well, for those who grow up in it, what your identity is formed into. for those who join, it starts to change and reform our identity. So I'm going to give you some ideas from my thinking. So I think one of the ways our identity is formed and shaped is through introjection when we're confluent. So being confluent is being merged, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So it's when we're confluent with and we introject from, I'll explain the terms, the leadership, and I'm focusing today on the leadership and the thought reform or brainwashing environment. I mean, there's, as you brought up, there's lots and lots of different areas that I could focus on, but I haven't got time. So confluence means flowing together. Rivers at the confluence, they flow together. And this is a quote from Walking Free. I use it here to refer to a merged state where our boundaries with others are blurry and indistinct, even non-existent, where we become enmeshed and entangled. And that it's a Gestalt psychotherapy term. And I thought it was quite a useful way of looking at it. I use certain language because I think it gets us thinking. If you're not familiar with the language, you can think, oh, okay, you know, maybe I can think about it. I hope that made sense. So an introject, and I use this a lot in therapy with clients. An introject is a belief or behavior that we have taken into ourselves without consciously assessing it. It is swallowed whole and remains sitting in our psychological system like a lump of unchewed and undigested food in our gut. The pressures put on us within the cultic setting make it almost impossible to chew over what we have been told or what happens to us. And so these things may remain within us and cause discomfort. And every former member I've ever worked with really struggles with introjects. And again, I'm using this particular term in a particular way. So in order to recover, we need to highlight and challenge the introjects. So an introject is, it's selfish to have a holiday, or I shouldn't look after myself, or that is selfish. And I mean, that's a simple one, or it's sinful to reflect on myself. I mean, there's so many, and there's lots of examples in the book. Is that clear? Do you have any question about what is an introject? So introjects and the things that we take in and believe that are actually moulding our sense of ourselves and our identity can actually become phobias. So when we leave the group, we're phobic about caring for ourselves, phobic about having holidays. What one introject someone told me was, you should burn out for Jesus, burn out. So constantly in their life post-cult, burning out, having mental breakdowns, because that hadn't been really highlighted. So that's, you know, moulding them. So there's a section on the idea of phobias and then critical thinking. So, and Stephen Hassan has a really good section in one of his books about phobias, so you can have a look at those as well. So often you can identify an introject through shoulds or oughts. And when I find myself saying I should do something, I brainwash myself so much with this idea that I kind of go, oh, should? Why should I? And then I kind of catch myself and think, should I? Or actually, do I need to make a free choice here? Is this some kind of pressure? Okay. Is that clear? Another definition of introjects is from the Dictionary of Psychology. Generally, the process by which aspects of the external world are absorbed into or incorporated within the self the internal representation then taking over the psychological functions of the external object. So unfortunately, we're in that setting, we take it in, we introject it, and then we start acting it out. And that's why we need, you know, we carry on the work of the cult by holding on or not challenging the introjects. And we need to take time to highlight them. So it's vital to highlight them, chew them over. And there's lots more I could say about that, but I'll keep it just simple. And, you know, using critical thinking. There's a section in the book about critical thinking. What is it? How can you kind of debunk and pull apart introjects? There's a whole list of introjects in there too. So when we're confluent and merged, and you can see here the outline of the unboundary, you know, there's no boundary around the individual member, and then you've got the leader and the codes just swallowing them up. The introjects flow in at the confluence. If we're confluent, we don't. One client said, I didn't have a shit filter, or you've got no teeth. You know, there's no teeth to chew over. You're not allowed to have teeth to chew over. You have to swallow it whole, drink it in. I was told once, you need to drink, not think. Whoa, you know, and actually at that point where they said that, I was beginning to leave, and I actually felt like I was going crazy. I felt like my brain was beginning to unvelcro. You know what Velcro is like. That's so wrong. It's so wrong. So I'm just dipping into this because I could give a talk on each little aspect of this, but I take a Gestalt psychotherapy view of identity because there's so many different theories of identity. Many philosophers, many therapists, many psychologists have looked at it, but I actually liked this idea that identity is made up of self and personality. And personality is the relatively stable, who am I, with different aspects, sub-personalities, parts, and it distinguishes me from others. And then the self is seen as that ever-changing contact in a cycle with the personality, with others, or the environment, moment by moment. And the trouble is that when you're in a cult, the self aspects become squashed. I've got another diagram somewhere with that. And then the personality becomes squashed and starts to dissociate, split. And there's no real movement within the identity. It becomes rigid, a fixed gestalt it's called, but that's just a sort of technical term. But, you know, so I kind of like this idea because I think it's really important to know, actually they may not feel very stable. I know I didn't feel stable, but there are aspects of who I am that are different from you. And that's probably always the case to some degree or another. And then the personality can show all sorts of different aspects. So I, like here, you know, I have to put on my posh suit and speak, but as I said, there are other aspects to me. You know, I love my kids, I love my dog, my husband, I love reading novels, etc. They're all part of me. So I hope that's kind of clear. So when the introjects flow in, the things that we swallow whole that we haven't chewed over, because we're confluent, the cult and the leadership, and then the self and the personality, when they're merged in confluence, the introjects flow in. And we're sitting in the meetings, like for me, I was in a Bible-based group, so you have these repetitive songs. I think that happens, you know, in lots of different groups, or the mantras or chanting or meditation that you know, this whoever's speaking, you know, it starts to just flow in, and we're not using our teeth and thinking about what's being said. So it's really important that we always can do that. And I think this is shaping, it's kind of, these aspects start being squashed and shaped and moved into what they think we should be in order to, you know, fulfill their aims. Does that make sense? Good, that's a relief. So also, I thought I'd look at identity being shaped through the leadership, and you know, that we hear this a lot, and I think it's true. The leader is crucial to most groups. I mean, JWs, there's the what do they call it? Claire, what do they call it? No, she's not listening. So so the sort of board of governors, you know, there are boards and things.
The leadership governing body.
Thank you. You answer. Governing body. So, you know, they're different kind of structure types. I thought I'd just walk you through that. And these are also in the book. So I thought long and hard, and there's probably some missing, you know, so I'm curious if there are, and I'll add it if there's ever a second edition. Authority figures who are respected and endorsed and approved by society, but who hide in plain sight because society does not realise or recognise their abusers. So there's lots of people. There's in the UK, there've been some terrible cases of priests, I mean, across the world, really, people who are respected and endorsed, but who are actually abusing. There was one, I can't remember his name actually, one priest who set up a sort of monastery in his house, and he was abusing the boys that he recruited into this monastery. And Prince Charles gave him a house on his estate, and everybody was lauding this person, and he was causing absolute havoc.
Peter Paul.
Thank you. Yes. The source of all information in that area. Stephen, thank you. And then there's the hidden kind of puppet masters, those who are controlling from behind closed doors, and people don't really realise, you know, that actually they're moving the parts around. And then that we know, you know, we talk often about narcissistic, powerful leaders not endorsed by society generally, who want to be seen and elevated for their assumed power and gifts. And those are the gurus and the church pastors who, you know, kind of, who are fringe. These are the more fringe ones. And then the hidden subtle narcissists, whose narcissism is marked by a kind of normality. And they can turn up in the workplace, they can be in families, and they're pernicious. And then founders. So the thing about some of these sort of older groups, multi-generational groups, but not so old that the founders, you know, who historically led the group, who may have died, but they still hold a lot of influence over the members who continue to follow their rules and edicts. And there's a lot of examples of those. And then there's the dominant individuals in the one-to-one relationships. The father, it can be a child or a sibling, can be the mother, and dominant individuals in small family groups. Sorry, dominant individuals in intense one-to-one relationships, which is kind of a one-on-one cult, coercive control, that kind of situation. And then dominant individuals in small family groups. So those are the types of leaders that I came up with. Off the top of your head, is there anything missing? Like, do you think, actually, you haven't mentioned this or that? Try to kind of generalize, you know, where there's so many specifics and different experiences. Yes?
You might add or color some of those descriptions with the ones who have messianic pretensions.
Messianic in the most general sense.
Or they claim to be, you know, the reincarnation
that.
of this one or that one,
Yeah.
and therefore they speak with divine authority
Yeah.
and they're harder to
Yes,
resist
that's
because
true. Yeah.
they
They're
have direct connection that you don't.
Yes, I guess they're there, but not so explicit, so that's really helpful, thank you. Any questions? Thank you, Arthur, that's helpful. Okay. So we introject from the abusive leadership. And so in order to recover, and this was the biggest category within my PhD research, we need to unmask the cult leader. That's how I categorized it, was my way of putting that, in order to walk free and recover. So it was interesting looking at the first generation and why they actually joined, and some of them said their motivation for joining. I know some people find the term joining offensive, and I don't mean it to be offensive, but it's trying to delineate between the two. But those who are recruited or joined, they believe that the leader, the guru, was the embodiment of God, which is kind of what Arthur's saying, had special power to point them to a higher spiritual being, and they needed them to do that. You know, they couldn't have a higher spiritual being for themselves. They had the leader had the power to transform their life. So this was going to be a healing experience, but it wasn't. Could heal them and fulfill their needs, and could give them purpose and direction for their life. So this is a pretty heavy weighted on the power of the leader. And so from the data, what came through was we all need to bring them down to earth, see them as a weak human, dissect their persona, really look at their psychology. And we need to understand their psychology and psychological background. Actually, that can be very helpful. This man was either a pathological narcissist, a sociopath, antisocial personality disorder, or he was a god. I mean, that's a pretty, it's quite extreme, really. So we all need to debunk beliefs and introjects about the leader, that the leader knows better than me, that somehow they're the most important member of the group. And we need to challenge idealization or projection onto the leader and disarm their power. This is the key thing. And it can be quite challenging. And these introjects about the leader can often be quite phobic. So in the therapy, I often deal with the cult leader at the end of the therapy rather than, no, we have discussions about, that's what I mean. Later on in the post-cult therapy, because it can actually hit those phobias. So people need some time to chew over other things before really kind of going for the cult leader. And in that process, I'm also working to disarm the power imbalance with myself, that I'm a person, I'm Gillie, I'm nothing special, I'm not the expert on you, I don't know you, you know yourself, and I'm not a leader, and I don't use transference to pull a transference with the leader. That would be dangerous. So I hope that's clear to some people. If you don't understand the term, I apologize, but it's to actually try and create more, it's not exactly a peer relationship, but to disarm the power, because otherwise you can abort the therapy. It's not going to be that helpful. So here, understanding the dynamics with the leader or the perpetrator, and Daniel Shaw's books are fantastic in looking at the whole issue of narcissism, some of the dynamics, the profile of a leader, and a profile of all sorts of other narcissists. And that it sets up this, in the confluence and the introjection and everything, it sets up this, this is within the code. that they're kind of projecting to us as members, you're bad, I'm good. So then we project back, oh, you're good, I'm bad. And I've kind of interjected that dynamic, and I did that, you know, just looking up to somebody else. Took me years to stop doing that, and I've tried. It probably catches occasionally. We talk a lot about experts and things, but you know, we have to hold those terms quite lightly, really. I think. And then there's also this interaction of you're weak, you member, I'm strong, you know, but they're not. I'm strong and powerful, and then we're like, oh, you're strong and powerful and I'm weak. And that exchange is very, very dangerous, and it really can shape our sense of who we are. When I left my group, I thought I was toxic. I did. And so I found it really hard to speak, to interact with people, because I thought I'm going to harm them. And I hid. Yeah, you're going, yeah.
Yeah, I still think that.
Yeah.
Literally.
Do you? So it sticks, it sticks. Someone's saying they still can feel that here after leaving. And it's an introject, and it needs challenging, because it really isn't true. It's not true of you, and it's not true of me. I have good intentions, I want to do well, and I can sometimes get it wrong. But that's not the same thing as being toxic or trying to harm people. Okay. So Maribel, who was the previous quote, she said it was important for me to see him for what he was. I really saw myself as a victim, not as a willing victim. I don't see myself that way. I see myself as someone who was a victim, who was psychologically, she used another word, but I didn't want to trigger people, abused. Spiritually and psychologically abused. Yeah, he had me emotionally captive for many years. And then she unmasked him, and she said, as soon as I realized he had no power over me, there was just me left. She was first generation, it's simpler. It's not as complicated as for second and multi-generation, but it really struck me. It was like just me left, actually. Once I got rid of the introjects or whatever, that way I saw him. So any questions or comments about that? Yes.
I can't help but find it difficult to distinguish between cult and religion in a lot of the things that's there about, you know, that I am sinful.
Yes,
You
it's
see a lot
religion, yeah.
in the ex-cult community about saying, well, I'm weak and I need
Yeah.
God. But it's always been of interest where that lies, so obviously why my propensity to leave religion together.
Yeah.
But just understanding that difference between what you would consider as being cultic and what would just be standard religion. And I struggle to separate the two, but maybe there's people who know more about this stuff.
Well, I think sort of the way I approach it is that, and this was true for me, although obviously I understand, you know, you were born into the group, from what I heard of your talk yesterday. Is I treat the religious aspect as introjects. The religion is introjected. The language is introjected. So, and it can be triggering trying to handle that language, because actually you're like, I don't want to ever hear this again. But sometimes, and I know at Gloria Vale, where are you? There you are. There you are. Like they're actually helping people to exit by looking at the theology. Now, not everyone wants to do that, and that's fine. So it can just be treated as an introject, but actually it's still the loaded language, which I'll come on to. It still needs trawling through if you're up to it, you know. But if it's seen as something that I swallowed, I had to swallow, I was forced to swallow it, but I actually am going to get rid of it. So we get rid of introjects, and it's a very physical thing. Jamie was talking about the physical process, her research, you know, that our body is always involved, and actually it's about sicking it up or pooing it out, you know, it goes through our body and we get rid of it. We chew it over, so it's, the analogy doesn't fully follow through, but you know, we don't want to swallow it, we want to, you know, look at it and challenge it. I hope that's clear. So that's how I view that. So the religion was used to control, and so it's put into that bracket. And it's more tricky for people who then want to hold on to the religion. It's actually in some ways easier if one's just going.
The whole basis of Christianity is that you're a sinner and the only way to get to
Yeah.
heaven is by Jesus.
I know.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, but they become introjects because not everyone holds their Christianity in that way. So, so we have to get back to how the cult was using those terms. It's not actually Christianity. The children of God is not Christianity. It's some perversion. And it makes me furious. Yeah, really. I'm not going to swear because I've got my posh rock on. Yes,
Yes, I have a quick question.
yes,
on-
speak up.
Yeah, I have a quick question on humanizing,
Yes,
because in the case of one-to-one violent relationships.
Yes.
Some victims explain that when humanizing their perpetrator,
yes,
that doesn't encourage them to run away from them, but on the contrary,
Okay.
it makes them feel like kind of pity for them. And
Oh.
it arises some kind of need to save them.
oh,
So do you think there is a risk of that?
right, well, I hadn't thought of that. So the comment is that in
Like-
some cases, it could cause someone to feel sorry for them or whatever. Yeah, well, that could happen, but in, say, in a therapy setting, I would challenge that. And I, you know, some of these leaders, some of the, like the cult leaders, have elevated themselves so high. That, you know, God speaks to them and nobody else, and they can choose who's going to marry who and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I mean, that would be something to be really careful about.
Gillie, can I speak to that? a little bit?
Yes, please.
I think there's an opportunity there. I mean, it's a little hard because I don't know what that context
Just
is.
speak up, but you can see what's being written here as well.
I don't know what the context of the question is, but I think you have an opportunity to say, like, if this person's behavior is hurting you, you know, they have some kind of a painful background.
Mhm.
It's important for you to know the background, but what's more important is that you're being hurt by the person,
Yes,
you know, and then their painful background is too bad, but you don't have to
Yeah.
fix it. engage.
thank you.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
I thinking about what you mentioned by Daniel Shaw about the two sides of the narcissist.
Yes,
Classic cult leader is the powerful one, but in the relationship, it could be the fragile narcissist, I'm the victim.
yes.
So there are two different types of, and if you have the victim, humanize them, you feel sorry for them.
Mhm.
You usually don't feel sorry for the infant, godlike figure.
Mhm.
So I understand, so that's in a different way of coming out of, yeah, you're a victim, but I'm a victim of you. Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty tough about it. I'm like, and I do kind of go, ugh, you know, and, you know, just like bullshit. And, you know, look, I was abused. I didn't go on and abuse. Loads of people are abused. They didn't go on and abuse. So, yeah, and I know your service specifically works with male perpetrators. So you have a tricky sort of balance there, and it's an interesting one. I think in coming out of the cult and just, you know, it has to, you know, the way I think is like simplifying. That's why in the book there's all these, they're not cartoons as that, but everything gets kind of simplified down because that's the way it helps me. Yeah, Claire, and then we'll move on.
I was just going to say, as a therapist that's trained with you and used this model of helping clients from all different cultural backgrounds over the 2 years that I've used it, to understand their experiences, it really works. And we've, been able to do some really good work. So it's just helping people to root out those introjects, and that happens over the course of the therapy process. You couldn't sit down at the beginning and write your introjects down because you have got blind spots. But as you begin to understand in your experience what is part of introductory thinking and how the cult has overlaid your identity, it's powerful stuff, and it really does. It helps people. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. So yes, so basically that person who's been with this horrible leader who's done horrible things, who cares about their, vulnerabilities? They need to sort them out themselves, what we need to do. So I think people say, don't they, imagine them on the toilet. I know that's a bit silly, but don't they say that, when you've got this big name, like imagine them on, I'm not asking you to do this, or whatever, just see them as a human being, not a god, or not messianic. Okay. So another way identity is, what time do we actually finish? 1 o'clock. Oh, cool. So, there's another session now, so I think some people are going to that. Please feel free, you're not trapped in here. Okay, so another way our identity is shaped is through thought form or thought forming. And this is, to me, this is the most important theory for former members, and really is a kind of key to walking out and walking free. So this is going to be a very quick overview, and I hope, and this is so thought reform or thought forming. So one day I used to run a support group, and one of the second generation said to me, she said, it's not thought reform, it's thought forming. So I honestly, completely, hopefully take that on board. But because the original term was thought reform, I kept the original term, okay, and I hope that's okay. So thought reform was the Robert J. Lifton's theory about how Korean and Chinese prisoners of war were, how their identity and how their sense of self and how that changed and how they were controlled. And it's brilliant. It's brilliant. So thought reform, thought formed. The 8 components emerged from research conducted by Robert J. Lifton with former Chinese and Western prisoners of war and converted and brainwashed by the Chinese communist regime. And there should be slides. The PowerPoint handout should be somewhere in some mystery place on Wover, Hoover, whatever you call it. So I have no idea, but apparently I sent them in. So anyway, you should be able to have access to them somewhere.
Apparently called Rover, according to that.
My dog's called Albie. Is your dog called Rover? So there are 8 components of thought reform, and I've used the original language again so we can get our names around, our heads around it. It's not just loaded with everyday meaning. Lots of you know about this. Milieu control, mystical manipulation, demand for purity, confession, sacred science, loading the language, doctrine of the person, and dispensing of existence. So the short version, milieu control, don't look in, don't look out, and don't look in. Internal and external control of communication, personal time and energy, personal life, time and energy. Mystical manipulation, they're so spiritual or elevated that you believe them, and it's a they create a planned spontaneity that creates a mystique justifying extensive personal manipulation from the leader. The demand for purity is you were no good before, if you joined, and you're no good now for everyone. And you must become pure as defined by the group or relationship. Confession, well, you tell them everything, which gives them ammunition. The sacred science, they know the truth better than you, and they hold the ultimate moral vision. Loading the language, don't think about the words you use, they're thought-terminating cliches. Doctrine over person, what we believe is more important than you personally. The doctrine replaces, this is also a point, when I was doing the book, I realised that the doctrine replaces the reality and well-being of the individual. Doctrine over person is actually quite extensive and deep. And it's dispensing of existence. We know who should exist and who shouldn't. They decide who has the right to exist and who does not. And that can happen on a micro scale, moment by moment, or it might be that you're shunned and removed from the group. So I'll come to that. So I'm going to go through these. Like, hands up, who's very familiar with thought reform? Yeah. So there's some people who aren't. So I'm going to go through it, and I hope it's, it becomes clear. This is a system. So the 8 components work together, but you don't necessarily need all of them or full blast for it to actually be creating control. So milieu control, Lipton says it's the psychological current which carries the individual into a full thought reform system. So if you think of a current in the sea, it's if you get into that current, you get swept in. And milieu control is control of the environment and social life, control of communication with outsiders and within oneself, and self-suppression. So it's both. This is the biggest one in a sense. We're then deprived of external information which moderates our thinking and helps us to debate in ourselves and look at different things. And we're deprived of a personal inner reflection. And both are necessary to test reality and maintain differentiation and not become confident. Critical thinking becomes compromised. So that's a very short summary. Any comments or questions about that? So then, Lifton said mystical manipulation is the inevitable next step. It's an extensive behavioural and emotional personal manipulation. Coercion and control, it elevates the leader, so you can see special, divine, messianic. There's an addictive element to mystical manipulation and altered states of consciousness, and a trance can occur here, convincing the member that what is believed is real. So you've got the maybe the repeated mantras, the meditation, the repeated singing of songs, which creates certain altered states. Also, I wrote an article about this actually. When we're in a state of confluence, we're actually in a state of trance, what I call the confluential trance. And so we're much more vulnerable to the mystical manipulation from the leader. So I hope that's clear. Any questions about that? So then the demand for purity, there's an absolute separation between the pure and impure, good and bad, is deemed to be possible. This separation is deemed to be possible. The world is bad, or the system or whatever, and in here is good. There's all or nothing thinking. Purity is assumed to be attainable, but only attainable within the cultic settlement. All that went before, for those who joined, must be rejected. Guilt and shame mechanisms are taken over by the cultic setting and the leadership. And so the purity culture in some groups and, you know, and the redefinition of purity, that, you know, it's okay for everyone to be sexualized, somehow becomes the demand for purity. It's so messed up. And this is where, you know, there's this split thinking. Is that clear? I mean, this is a whistle-stop tool. So then confession out within the group is beyond the normal legal, religious or therapeutic expressions. The subject lets down their barriers and openly discusses their innermost fears, thus giving ammunition to others, especially the leadership. And that's made possible because of the human tendency toward guilt and shame and the need to give these expression. So we feel guilty, so then we confess. And it can be a vehicle of a kind of self-purification. We feel better, but we don't. And it's an act of symbolic self-surrender and maintains an ethos of total exposure. So, you know, it's very dangerous to confess in a cultic setting. And then there's confession to oneself, which of course I carried on for years, telling myself I was toxic, and the individual reiterates the negative introjects in a sort of self-confession. You're stupid. I believed I was stupid for so many years. And my dear husband had to keep saying, look, you know, you're telling people you're stupid, but you're not stupid. And I proved to myself I wasn't stupid, but I completely introjected them. And it can look like low self-esteem when we confess, like the stupid, toxic, unworthy, but it's actually introjects and the pseudo-identity speaking. It's not the authentic identity, it's the identity the cults formed within us. Points. So then the sacred science is the ideology or the truth that's the ultimate science, apparently, of human behaviour. The leadership build the mystical manipulation on the belief that they have access to this ultimate truth and so are above criticism. And those who harbour doubts or critical thought, this truth, they then become impure in terms of demand for purity. They become, these are Lifton's terms, immoral or unscientific or apostates or whatever. And the leadership thus ensures members suppress their internal dialogue, milieu control, and that maintains introjection, projection, confluence, and compliance. So the belief system is very important. Any comments? And then loading the language. Yes, limiting the meaning of words. These are all really important, and I don't hope I'm not losing you, but they're working together. All of these are working together to kind of form us. And loading the language is limiting the meaning of words to those that affirm the prevailing ideological claims of the sacred science. So the language is loaded. You know, sin is a loaded word, or sorry if it's triggering. You know, these are loaded with meaning from the cults, and they create a new vocabulary by creating new words with special meanings. They're understood only by members of the group. So systemize, I mean, that's just a word, like what the hell does that mean? You know, or the world, or like so many weird phrases. Understood only by members of the group, giving new and special meanings to familiar words and phrases. Thought-provoking complexities are bypassed and ultimate truth expressed in a single word or phrase. Or few words, phrase, results in thought stopping, and I think feeling stopping as well, actually. It really works to shut us down. Any comments on that one? Yes?
I think it's important for people who want to help a loved one, that they can be confused by the language, because it sounds like a normal language,
Yes.
but you have no idea it means love means I will beat you, love means I will treat you bad, right? So you need to understand the words and ask for what seems obvious, right? But it's a whole different meaning on every word, so don't be confused by a simple ideology word.
That's crucial. Love is the word. Catherine, you had this great a bomb with love written on it. Well, that's love bombing, of course, but the term love, always be suspicious when people are talking about love. It never means what you think it means in a cultic kind of context. That's a great example, actually. Thank you. So then doctrine over person is the doctrine takes precedence over any individual or their well-being or other teaching from outside because members believe it is real. So we believe the doctrine or the sacred science is real. Like, this is real. Living in a real world of this so-called God and this so-called whatever. And all private perceptions must be subordinated to these ideological claims. And contrary experiences must be denied. So within my group, the press started to get hold of the beatings. We were physically beaten in the group. And so the leader just started to say, oh, well, that didn't really happen, or kind of reframing reality, really. And then private thoughts are attributed to residual impurity. So, you know, if you think for yourself or you have doubts, you know, what do you do with them? This is, you know, impurity. Anything to say about that? No. You're still awake. This is the last one. So the leadership, the dispensing of existence, the leadership in the cultic setting decides who has the right to exist and who does not. And who has the right to remain a member and who does not. And this is where shunning comes in, and sometimes murder. There's occasionally, not very often. And, you know, there's threats about the consequences of leaving. I stayed for years because I believed I was going to hell. Now I just think that's ridiculous. But I'd introjected and had this kind of block in my head about it. And shunning, as I said, we're cut off by the group. So that's the 8 components of thought reform. If you can get hold of the handout, it's in my book, it's on the internet, you know, it's really worth knowing about and just thinking, actually, where do these apply to my situation? And because it starts to unlock a key of understanding the dynamics of the group, and it starts to undo the forming and help to really come out of it and, you know, kind of see it for what it was. Like, I can explain this. This is what they were doing. We're a part of it. Okay. So we have 20 minutes left. So I'm going to carry on. So I think this forming, the leader, the thought reform, all the things that are happening in that setting, all the things other people said earlier, are starting to lead to a cultic pseudo-identity. Look, some people struggle with this term, and I try to, it's come from some of the literature, and it's trying to say the person you had to be within the group. That's all it is. It's a very simple idea. Not that simple an idea, but that's what it's meant to me. And I'm working with someone who's given me explicit permission to share this, and this is their name. And he said, people's internal makeup is shaped by other people in the cult. And I love that. I thought, just put it into words, something about this forming and all the pressures coming from other people, from the thought reform. And so the cultic pseudo-identity, when we're subjected to brainwashing or thought reform throughout our life and into adulthood, I think we form an identity to comply and fit in. Maybe not 100%, we might be having doubts, we might be trying to fight it, but actually it's still having an effect. And I've worked with someone for a long time who was brought up, so he's multi-generation and didn't believe the belief system, thought it was rubbish. But actually, I said to them the other day, I said, it's really interesting to me that you grew up in that setting, you didn't believe it, but you still interjected aspects of it. And they said, absolutely. And we had to do a lot of work around interjects, even though they didn't believe it. So it's sort of believing it and not believing it. I call this the cultic pseudo-identity, and I see this as overlaying the individual's authentic identity for first generation and for born and raised. But those who grow up, and you know, I'm open to criticism on this, but those who grow up into adulthood form a cultic pseudo-identity, but for born and raised, it's deeper and more entangled into their authentic identity, I think. So there's a different job to do, trying to say, well, if you think of the personality, the more stable parts of us, and who am I? I'm good at art. Well, you aren't good at art, or, you know, there are aspects of me that identify me separate. You look different, or, you know, I love different things, you know, so they kind of, that kind of thing. That makes sense. Yeah. So just to say something about the authentic identity, I think of the authentic identity being evident when an individual is creatively adjusting or living for and working for the service of their own psychological health and their personality, and not twisted against themselves. So I became twisted against myself. You're toxic, you know, you're stupid, you know, you can't do anything, only the men can do it, you know, women don't count, and all those things. And that was being twisted against myself. That was my cult pseudo-identity. That was what I took on and interjected and believed. So I think the authentic identity is evidence when the individual is creatively adjusting in the service of their own psychological health and their personality, and not twisted against themselves in the service of others or a spiritually abusive group or their pseudo-identity. And we're allowed to put ourselves first. On the plane, they say, put the mask on yourself before on your dependents. We put the mask on ourselves first, and then we can help other people. And that can be our authentic identity. And I think to recover, we need to recognise and unlayer the pseudo-identity and free our real me, or as one client put it, my real me, or authentic identity underneath. But how? And I think we do this by understanding the dynamics within the coercive, cultic, or spiritually abusive setting, and how our identity developed. And we do this in phases. So, anything you want to say about that identity thing? I'm going to just explain the phases. Yes, this is trauma. I haven't got to the phases. In fact, would you mind if I just go to the, I just want to tell you about the phases of recovery. So I knew I'd run out of time, but you know, look, the handout's there, but I think of recovery in phases, and these are focused phases for in therapy or in life. And sorry, that slide always does that. Phase one is, I think we need, and we had a conversation about this in the clinical roundtable, we need to leave physically as much as we can and begin to leave psychologically. So as we're leaving physically, we're starting to get some understanding about what happened. Then phase two, focus in therapy, is we need to leave psychologically. We need to build an authentic identity. I understand that word's problematic for some people. Through cognitive understanding in psychoeducation, we need to start to try and come to who we are, find our real me, whatever language you want to use. Yes, it may be movable and changeable, but we need to find something of, you know, what do I like? What are those Cs? And that's really beginning to understand what is our pseudo identity. The focus then of phase 3 is we need to leave psychologically and build an authentic identity through emotional healing. Addressing, this is the developmental work, addressing the suppressed feelings, trauma, loss, developmental issues. The focus then comes in phase 3, because in phase 2, we've understood what happened, or we've started to understand, started to unpack it. And my book is written for phase 2, that is phase 2 journey. Phase 3, you need a therapist, you know, and that's problematic for so many people because they can't find someone who knows what they're talking about. And then phase 4 is recognizing, again, my term, recognizing who am I, and recovery and post-traumatic growth. So, you know, did I grow from this? Didn't I? You know, and moving on. Like I focus on, actually, it's okay. I can more or less leave this behind. I can go into social activism, or I can just say, I don't want any more to do with this. And people do both. So I had a whole load more stuff, but I think we're probably finished, are we?